Where do the songs go when no one listens anymore? Do they fade into silence like whispers swallowed by the wind? Or do they linger, waiting in the air, yearning for a heart to carry them forward? The story follows Edward, an elderly, widowed pianist and composer who lives immersed in loneliness and sadness since the death of his beloved wife, Margaret. His routine is broken by the arrival of Clara, a curious and sensitive 10-year-old girl who lives with her grandmother next door and is drawn to the music she hears coming from Edward's house. Clara, who also carries the pain of losing her own parents, convinces Edward to teach her how to play the piano. This bond causes Edward to reconnect with the world and rediscover his passion for music. Before we continue with this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and like the video. Oh, and don't forget to comment below where you're watching us from. We love to know that. Edward Collins often asked himself these questions in the stillness of early morning. At 78, mornings had become both a blessing and a weight. Each sunrise reminded him that he was still here, alive, breathing, existing, but also that so much of what had defined his life was already gone. The house was too large for one person, and though the neighbors lived close, the walls of silence around him felt impenetrable. He sat by the piano, his most faithful companion. Its keys had yellowed with time, like teeth in a smile too long unshared. Dust clung to the polished wood, though he still wiped it daily, more out of habit than necessity. He pressed one key, then another, and a fragile sound broke the silence. The melody drifted through the room like a sigh, hesitant, incomplete. The smell of coffee, strong and slightly burnt, mingled with the faint mustiness of old sheet music stacked in piles around him. On the mantel, a photograph of Margaret, his late wife, watched with her timeless smile. She had been gone for 10 years, yet Edward still spoke to her sometimes, whispering into the empty room as if she might answer. "Another morning, my love," he murmured. His voice cracked, and he cleared his throat as though embarrassed by the sound. Routine carried him forward. He poured the coffee, black as night, into a chipped white mug. He sat by the window and listened to the hum of the neighborhood. Cars starting, dogs barking, a child laughing faintly in the distance. Life outside moved forward, but his felt paused, like a record stuck on the same groove, repeating endlessly. It was then that he noticed it again, the small sound of footsteps outside his door. Light, hesitant, almost playful. He had heard them before, often when he played the piano. Sometimes a shadow lingered on the porch, but he had never opened the door to look. Whoever it was seemed harmless, just listening. Edward returned to the piano. His fingers found the shape of a melody he hadn't played in years, one he had written in the days when Margaret would sit beside him, humming. He stumbled over the notes, his hands slower now, clumsier. The sound wavered, imperfect but sincere. And then, 3 knocks. Soft. He froze, staring at the door. For a moment he considered ignoring it. He wasn't expecting anyone. At his age, unexpected visitors usually meant either bad news or people selling something he didn't want. But the knocks came again, gentle, almost polite. With a sigh he rose, joints creaking like old hinges. He opened the door. There stood a girl, small, perhaps 10 years old, with hair the color of autumn leaves and eyes wide with a mixture of fear and determination. She clutched a school bag against her chest as if it were a shield. "Hello, sir," she said quietly. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to bother you." Edward blinked, unsure what to say. Children rarely spoke to him anymore. "I was just listening," she continued, her voice trembling. "You play the piano. It sounds beautiful." A strange warmth spread through his chest. He wanted to dismiss her, to retreat back into the safety of his silence. But something in her eyes, honest, hungry, almost desperate, made him pause. "What's your name?" he asked, his voice softer than he expected. "Clara," she said. "I live next door, with my grandma." He nodded slowly. He had seen her before, running across the yard, her laughter ringing like bells, though he had never spoken to her. You like music, Clara? She nodded eagerly. I've never heard it so close before. My grandma says she used to play, but she doesn't anymore. Edward hesitated. He wasn't sure why this child had appeared at his door, why she was drawn to his stumbling notes. Yet for the first time in years, he felt less like a ghost drifting through his house, and more like a man someone could see. Would you like to come in? He asked at last. Her eyes lit up, and for a heartbeat the silence of his house felt broken, not by music, but by the promise of connection. Perhaps songs never disappear. Perhaps they simply wait for new ears, for a new soul to find them. Edward had long believed that routine was a kind of shield, a sequence of small rituals, coffee at dawn, the newspaper folded just so, the same worn slippers shuffling across the wooden floor, kept him safe from the chaos of unexpected change. At his age, change felt less like adventure and more like a thief, stealing away comfort and certainty. But that morning, after Clara had stepped into his living room, the shield felt cracked. She looked around with curious eyes, her small hands brushing against the shelves stacked with records and the faded curtains that smelled faintly of lavender and dust. Her gaze lingered on the piano, standing proud but tired, like an old soldier still at his post. "Do you play every day?" she asked, stepping closer to the instrument. "Most days," Edward replied. He sat down on the bench, his back straight out of habit, though it soon ached. "It gives me something to do. Something to hold on to." Clara tilted her head, as though the piano were a mysterious creature. "The sound goes through the walls. I like to sit on the porch and listen. It's like a story without words." Her words startled him. Few adults ever spoke of music that way anymore. To them, it was background noise, a thing to fill the silence. But to Clara, it seemed alive. "Music is a story," he said after a pause. "Sometimes it's about love, sometimes about sorrow, sometimes both at once." She climbed onto a nearby chair, too shy to sit beside him just yet. "Was that song you played earlier about someone?" Edward's throat tightened. He glanced at the photograph of Margaret on the mantel, her smile eternally young. "Yes," he said quietly. "It was about my wife. She's gone now, but the music, it remembers her when I cannot." Clara lowered her eyes, tracing a circle on the wooden armrest with her finger. "My mom and dad are gone too," she whispered. "Grandma says they're in heaven, but sometimes I just feel like they're far away and I can't reach them." The room stilled. Edward studied her face, the way her young eyes carried an ache too heavy for her years. For a moment, age dissolved. She was a child without parents. He was an old man without his wife. And they both carried silence that begged to be broken. He cleared his throat, pressing a soft chord on the piano. "Music can reach them, Clara. Maybe not in the way we hope, but every note carries memory, and memory is a bridge." Her lips curved into a small, fragile smile. "Then maybe you can teach me, so I can build a bridge too." Edward's instinct was to refuse. Teaching again felt like reopening a door he had long shut. Once he had been a professor, guiding eager young minds through the beauty of harmony and rhythm. But that was years ago, before Margaret's illness, before loneliness settled in his bones. And yet, looking at Clara's expectant face, he heard Margaret's voice in his mind, warm and encouraging. "Don't close yourself off, Edward. Share the music. Share yourself." He sighed. "All right. But you'll have to promise me one thing." Her eyes widened. "What?" "That you'll be patient. Music doesn't come quickly. It grows slowly like a garden. You can't rush it." Clara nodded solemnly, as though she were agreeing to something sacred. For the next hour, Edward showed her the simplest things: how to sit properly, how to let her fingers rest gently on the keys instead of pounding them. She giggled at her mistakes, and he found himself chuckling too, a sound that startled him, for he had not heard his own laughter in months. By the time her grandmother called her home, the sun was tilting westward, casting golden light across the room. Clara waved as she left, her hair glowing like fire in the setting sun. The house grew quiet again, but it was not the same silence. It felt fuller, as if Clara had left a trace of her presence behind, like a lingering note at the end of a song. That evening, Edward opened the old notebook hidden beneath the piano lid. Its pages were filled with half-written melodies, smudged ink, and unfinished thoughts. His hand trembled as he turned the pages until he found one at the back. The last melody. He stared at it for a long time. He had never been able to finish it after Margaret's passing. It had felt wrong, incomplete, too bound to grief. But now he wondered if perhaps it wasn't meant to be finished by him alone. Routines keep us safe, but sometimes it takes a single voice, young or old, to remind us that life is still waiting beyond the walls we build. The next morning dawned with the same quiet rhythm as always. Coffee, newspaper, silence. But for Edward, something felt different. The air seemed lighter, less oppressive, as though the shadows in his house had thinned. He caught himself glancing at the piano more often, half expecting the sound of small footsteps outside his door. Sure enough, just as the clock struck 10, there came the familiar tapping of knuckles. Edward opened the door to find Clara again, this time holding a notebook of her own. Its cover was scratched and the corners bent, as if she carried it everywhere. "I thought," she said breathlessly, "that if you teach me, I should have a place to write things down, like you do." Her eagerness stirred something in him. He stepped aside, allowing her in, and she hurried straight to the piano as though it had been waiting for her. Edward sat beside her. "Music is not just about notes," he said, placing her small fingers on the keys. "It's about listening to yourself, to the silence, to the memories inside you." Clara frowned, trying a few clumsy scales. "That sounds hard." "It is," he admitted, smiling faintly. "But the most important things in life usually are." As the days passed, their lessons became a new kind of routine. Clara arrived almost every morning after finishing her schoolwork, her face glowing with anticipation. Edward guided her through simple melodies, and though she often stumbled, she never grew discouraged. Her laughter filled the room, softening the sharp edges of his solitude. One afternoon, as the golden light of dusk slanted across the piano, Clara's eyes wandered to the old notebook resting on the music stand. She pointed to a page at the back. "What's this one called?" she asked. Edward's heart clenched. The title stared back at him in faded ink. "The Last Melody." "It's unfinished," he said slowly. "I started it many years ago, but I never found the ending." "Why not?" He hesitated. The truth weighed heavily on his tongue. "Because it was meant for Margaret, my wife. After she passed, the music felt too heavy to carry alone." Clara's brow furrowed in thought. She reached out and traced the notes with her finger, as though they were secrets carved into stone. "Then maybe," she whispered, "it wasn't meant for you to finish alone. Maybe you need someone else to help." Her words struck him like a chord struck with perfect resonance, unexpected, clear, undeniable. He looked at her, this child with eyes full of loss and yet brimming with hope, and realized she had spoken a truth he had avoided for years. "I wouldn't even know where to begin," he muttered, almost to himself. Clara grinned mischievously. "Well, I'm just learning. So, we can begin at the beginning, right?" That evening they started. Edward played the incomplete melody, its notes haunting and unresolved, while Clara hummed along, inventing little phrases, offering ideas. It was clumsy, imperfect, but there was joy in the attempt. The piano room, once a chamber of silence, became a place of collaboration. Edward rediscovered the spark of teaching, not in theory or perfection, but in the raw beauty of creation. Clara scribbled in her notebook furiously, sketching crooked notes and tiny stars beside passages she loved. As the weeks unfolded, their bond deepened. Edward found himself telling her stories of Margaret, how she used to sing while cooking, how she painted wildflowers in the garden, how she once danced in the rain and dragged him with her. Clara listened with wide eyes, as though Margaret's spirit were being stitched into the music with every word. In return, Clara shared her own stories about her parents, the accident she barely remembered, the nights she lay awake wishing she could hear their voices again. She confessed that sometimes she felt invisible, like a shadow passing through her grandmother's house. "You're not invisible here," Edward told her gently. "Not to me." Her smile that day was worth more than any applause he had ever received in his teaching years. One afternoon, as they struggled with a particularly stubborn passage in the last melody, Clara laughed and said, "It's like building a bridge, isn't it? Each note is like a plank, and together they make a path from your memories to mine." Edward froze. A bridge. That was exactly what it felt like. Music spanning the gulf between generations, between grief and hope, between the past and the future. When Clara left that evening, Edward lingered by the piano, staring at the unfinished score. For the first time in a decade, he no longer feared it. With Clara beside him, he believed the melody might finally find its end. When grief feels too heavy to carry alone, sometimes another soul comes along, not to take the weight, but to help weave it into something new. There are silences that comfort, and there are silences that wound. Edward had lived in the second kind for far too long. It was the silence of empty chairs at dinner, of beds half filled, of words spoken into air that never answered back. For years, he had carried this silence like a second skin. But now, as Clara sat beside him at the piano, the silence felt different, fragile, waiting to be filled not just with music but with truth. It was a rainy afternoon. Drops tapped gently against the window, like a metronome keeping time. The smell of wet earth drifted in through the cracked frame. Edward played a few chords, letting them swell and fade. Clara leaned forward, her chin resting on her small hands. "Can I ask you something?" she said suddenly. "Of course." She hesitated, her voice low. "What was it like when your wife died?" Edward's fingers froze on the keys. No one had asked him so plainly in years. People avoided the subject as if grief were contagious. He stared at the ivory keys, searching for words. "It was like..." He paused, swallowing hard. Like someone turned off the music in the middle of a song. One moment it was there, alive, bright, full of harmony. The next, silence. A silence so heavy I thought I'd never breathe again. Clara's eyes glistened. She nodded slowly, as if she understood. "That's how I felt when Grandma told me about my parents. I don't even remember the accident. Just one day, they were gone. And then the house got so quiet. Too quiet." The piano room held its breath. Edward turned to her, really seeing her, not just as a child, but as someone who had walked through a valley of loss too soon. Her small shoulders carried a weight no child should bear. "Do you miss them every day?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Every single day," Edward said. "But I've learned something. Missing someone is another way of loving them. Love doesn't end when life does. It just changes shape." Clara bit her lip as though holding back tears. "Sometimes I'm scared I'll forget them. Their voices, their faces." Edward reached for the old notebook on the stand, flipping to the last melody. He pointed to the unfinished lines. "That's why I write. Because memory fades. But music keeps them close. Every note is like saying their name again." She leaned closer, her small finger tracing the notes. "Then maybe if we finish this, it will keep both of them close. Your wife, my parents, all of them." Edward's chest ached, but not with despair, with a kind of tender hope he hadn't felt in years. "Yes," he whispered. "Perhaps it will." They began to play again. The melody was hesitant, stumbling, but it carried more than sound. It carried confession. It carried wounds laid bare. At one point, Clara pressed the wrong key and burst into a nervous laugh, wiping at her damp eyes. Edward chuckled softly, shaking his head. "Even pain has wrong notes," he said. "But together they can still make a song." The hours slipped by, and when Clara finally left for the evening, the rain had stopped. Edward stood at the doorway, watching her run across the yard toward her grandmother's house, her hair damp and glowing under the faint sunset. Back inside, he sat again at the piano. The silence returned, but it no longer cut so sharply. It was softer now, shaped by the words they had shared. He pressed a single key, letting the note linger. And for the first time in a decade, he felt that Margaret might still be listening. Silence can wound, but when we dare to share it, the silence becomes a vessel for healing. Grief divided is still heavy, but grief shared can transform into remembrance. The house had grown accustomed to Clara's visits. The sound of her footsteps on the porch no longer startled Edward. Instead, it made his heart lift in quiet anticipation. She brought a kind of light that filtered through the cracks of his loneliness, the way morning sun slipped through half-closed blinds. On a cool Saturday morning, she burst in carrying a plate of cookies her grandmother had baked. "For you," she announced proudly, placing them on the table as if they were an offering to the piano itself. Edward smiled. "Tell your grandmother she's spoiling me." Clara grinned. "She says you need feeding. She doesn't trust you to eat more than coffee and bread." He chuckled, realizing with some embarrassment that the old woman was probably right. After nibbling a cookie, Clara climbed eagerly onto the bench beside him. "Can we work on that one again?" she asked, pointing to the worn notebook that never left the piano's side. Edward hesitated. His hand lingered on the cover. The last melody. He had avoided the piece for so long that just looking at it felt like touching a wound. Yet Clara's enthusiasm was contagious. She wasn't afraid of unfinished things. He opened to the fragile, yellowed page. The title stretched across the top in his neat handwriting. A little faded now. The Last Melody. Beneath it, the notes trailed off mid-line, like a story with no ending. Clara tilted her head. "Why did you call it that?" Edward exhaled, leaning back. "Because when I wrote it, I thought it would be the last song I'd ever need. Margaret was sick, and I poured everything into it. Love, sorrow, hope. But then, when she passed, I couldn't finish it. It felt like trying to write the end of my own life." Clara's small hands pressed flat against the page. "But it's not the end," she said firmly. "You're still here, and so is the music. Maybe it's waiting for you to remember that." Her certainty pierced him. He looked at her. This child who had lost so much and yet spoke as though she carried a well of wisdom deeper than her years. "Perhaps," he murmured, "it's waiting for us." Clara's eyes shone. "Then let's do it together." They began slowly. Edward played the opening measures, the haunting theme he had written all those years ago. Clara hummed along, sometimes off-key, sometimes inventing little variations that made him smile despite himself. When the melody reached the empty space, Edward's fingers hovered, uncertain. "Go on," Clara urged. "Make something up." "I can't just make it up," Edward protested. "Music doesn't work that way." "Why not?" she countered. "You told me music is a story. Stories can change, can't they?" Her words echoed inside him. Stories could change. Perhaps this one was never meant to end in sorrow. Perhaps it was meant to bend, to carry both grief and hope at once. Tentatively, Edward struck a new chord. It didn't quite fit, but Clara clapped anyway. "That's it. That's the bridge." He laughed, shaking his head. "You have no patience, child." "Neither do you," she teased. "But that's why we need each other." Day by day, they chipped away at the melody. Edward found himself scribbling new notes in the margins, guided not only by memory of Margaret but by the bright spark of Clara's presence. She added her own ideas, small flourishes, playful rhythms, that surprised him. It was no longer just his song, it was theirs. One evening, after a particularly long session, Clara leaned back with a satisfied sigh. "When it's finished, you should play it for people. Not just for me. For everyone." Edward's heart jolted. "Oh no, those days are behind me." "Why?" she pressed. "Music isn't meant to stay locked inside a house. It's meant to be shared." Her words lingered long after she left. Edward sat in the dim room, staring at the photograph of Margaret. For years he had believed his music belonged only to the past. But now, with Clara's laughter echoing in his ears, he wondered if perhaps Margaret would have wanted the song to live on. Shared, not buried. He touched the keys softly, almost like a prayer. The last melody was awakening. Unfinished things are not failures. They are invitations. Sometimes it takes another soul to remind us that even broken melodies can find their ending. The first light of morning filtered into Edward's house, spilling across the piano in soft gold. For years, dawn had been a silent companion to his grief. But now, with Clara's daily visits, the mornings felt different, expectant, alive, as though the sun itself leaned in to listen. Clara arrived that day with a sketchbook tucked under her arm. "I drew something," she announced proudly, dropping it on the piano bench before plopping down beside him. Edward opened the book and found pages filled with uneven lines of musical notes, clumsy but enthusiastic. Above them, she had scribbled titles like Song of Cookies, Rain on the Roof, and Edward's Laugh. He raised an eyebrow, trying to hide his amusement. "You've been busy." "I'm practicing," she said with exaggerated seriousness. "If we're finishing the last melody, I have to know how to write music too." Her determination stirred something deep in him. "Very well," Edward said, playing along. "Then today, you shall be my student." Clara's eyes widened with delight. She sat up straighter as if preparing for the most important lesson of her life. Edward began with the basics: quarter notes, half notes, rests. He demonstrated on the piano, letting her clap the rhythms. Her claps were offbeat at first, but her laughter filled the mistakes with joy instead of frustration. Slowly, steadily, she began to match his tempo. "You see," he said softly, "music is more than notes. It's breath. It's heartbeat. You don't just play it. You live it." Clara nodded solemnly, as if he had just revealed a great secret. Then, with the earnestness only a child could carry, she whispered, "I think your heartbeat sounds like a piano." The words struck Edward still. For so long he had thought of his music as a relic of the past. But to Clara, it was life itself. They returned to the last melody. Clara hummed while Edward played, her voice weaving through the unfinished passages like a thread searching for its pattern. When they reached the part where the music faltered, Edward paused, waiting for inspiration. Clara didn't wait. She pressed a cluster of random keys, giggling at the jarring sound. "There. That's what it should be." Edward shook his head, chuckling. "That sounds like a cat walking across the keyboard." "But it made you laugh," Clara countered. "Maybe the song needs laughter too." He considered that. The original melody had been steeped in sorrow, but perhaps that was why he could never complete it. Maybe it needed a touch of light, a reminder that even in grief, joy could slip through. So he tried again, this time adding a playful trill that echoed her accidental cluster. To his surprise, it worked. The melancholy of the piece lifted slightly, carrying a glimmer of hope. Clara clapped her hands. "Yes, that's it. That's the morning part." "The morning part?" Edward asked. "Uh-huh. 'Cause mornings mean new beginnings." Her words resonated with him. Notes of dawn, he thought. Yes, that's what they are. Over the next week, their sessions grew longer, the house alive with sound. Neighbors passing by would slow down to listen, drawn by the music drifting from Edward's windows. Some even paused at the gate, smiling to themselves, though Edward was too focused on Clara to notice. One evening, after finishing a lively passage, Clara stretched her arms wide and declared, "When we're done, everyone has to hear this. Not just us, not just Grandma, everyone." Edward froze, his fingers resting on the keys. The thought of performing again, of stepping beyond the safety of his walls, filled him with dread. But Clara's gaze was unyielding, full of certainty. "Music isn't a secret," she said firmly. "It's a gift." He wanted to protest, to tell her he was too old, too tired, too broken. But the truth was, her belief in him made it harder to hide behind excuses. For the first time in decades, he felt possibility stir within him. That night, Alone at the piano, Edward played through what they had built so far. The melody still carried sorrow, but now it also carried Clara's laughter, her hope, her dawn. For the first time, he didn't feel like he was playing the last melody. It felt like he was playing a new one. Every dawn carries music, even if we cannot hear it yet. Sometimes it takes another's faith to remind us that beginnings hide inside endings. The living room had never been so alive. Sheet music littered the floor like fallen leaves. Pencils rolled beneath the piano bench, and Clara's laughter bounced off the old walls. Edward sat at the piano, his fingers wandering across the keys while Clara leaned on the lid, humming a melody she insisted was the missing piece. For weeks they had worked side by side. The once silent house now breathed with rhythm, carrying traces of sorrow but also glimmers of light. To Edward, it was as though Clara had unlocked a part of him long buried under dust and memory. But Clara was not satisfied. "We can't keep this just for us," she declared one afternoon, hands on her hips with the sternness of someone far older than her years. Edward raised an eyebrow. "And what do you propose we do?" "A recital," she said simply. "Right here, in your house. We'll invite people, Grandma, the neighbors, everyone. They need to hear what we made." Edward's stomach tightened. The word recital echoed in him like a bell tolling. Memories of stages, of audiences, of his trembling hands the night his wife passed away. Moments when music had betrayed him, or perhaps when grief had. "I don't think that's wise," he said quietly, trying to return to the safety of the keys. Clara didn't move. "Edward," she said, her voice softer now. "Music is like bread. It's meant to be shared. If you keep it to yourself, it grows stale." Her metaphor startled him, both simple and profound. He looked at her, this child who somehow spoke with the wisdom of ages, and he realized she was right. What was the purpose of finishing the last melody if it remained locked in his living room? Still, fear clung to him. "What if I can't?" he whispered. Clara slipped onto the bench beside him, her small hand resting gently on his weathered one. "Then I'll play with you. 2 hearts. 1 song." Her confidence wrapped around his trembling doubt like a warm blanket. The following days were a whirlwind. Clara, with all the seriousness of a concert organizer, marched around Edward's house making plans. She wrote invitations in her uneven handwriting, persuading her grandmother to deliver them to neighbors. She even made a sign, painted letters on cardboard that read, "One night only, the last melody, by Edward and Clara." Edward wanted to protest, but each time he saw her enthusiasm, something inside him softened. Perhaps this wasn't about perfection. Perhaps it was about presence. When the evening arrived, Edward found himself pacing nervously. He had dressed in a simple suit, one that smelled faintly of cedar from years in the closet. Clara wore a pale yellow dress, her hair tied with a ribbon. She looked like sunlight personified. People began to arrive. First Mrs. Hargrove from across the street, then the Johnson family, then more neighbors until Edward's living room hummed with quiet anticipation. Some carried flowers, others brought homemade pies. The atmosphere was warm, forgiving, nothing like the grand concert halls of his past. Edward stood frozen near the piano, his palms damp, but Clara tugged his sleeve and whispered, "Remember, it's just us. Everyone else is only here to listen to our story." The audience hushed as Edward sat down, Clara beside him. His heart pounded, but when he looked at her, eyes sparkling, feet barely touching the floor, he felt a strange calm settle over him. He placed his fingers on the keys. Clara gave a small nod. Together they began. The opening notes were fragile, like porcelain threatening to crack. But as the melody unfolded, Edward felt strength returning to his hands. Clara hummed along, her voice weaving in and out like a thread of light. The music carried sorrow, yes, but also laughter, the morning trill they had discovered, the playful notes born of Clara's mistakes. The room leaned closer, every soul caught in the current of sound. Tears shimmered in more than one pair of eyes. Mrs. Hargrove clutched her chest, whispering, "Beautiful." As the final passage approached, Edward hesitated. This was the part he had never managed to complete. But Clara nudged him with her elbow, a silent reminder that he wasn't alone. And then together they resolved the melody. Not with sorrow, but with hope, a gentle lift at the end, like the breaking of dawn. The room erupted into applause. Clara beamed, bowing dramatically, while Edward sat stunned, his chest tight with emotions too vast for words. For the first time in decades he had played without fear, and it was not just his music anymore, it was theirs. That night, after the guests left and the house fell quiet, Edward turned to Clara. "You were right," he said softly. "It wasn't a recital. It was a gift." Clara grinned, resting her head on his shoulder. "And we gave it together. Shared music is shared life. When two hearts unite in one melody, even the heaviest burdens find harmony." The morning after the recital, Edward awoke to a silence that was not empty, but full. The house seemed to hold the echoes of the previous night, the laughter, the applause, the swell of music that had risen like wings. For years, silence had been a prison. Now, it felt like a sanctuary. Clara arrived later than usual, carrying a small envelope in her hand. Her face was alight with curiosity. "This was in your mailbox," she said, handing it over. Edward turned it in his fingers. The handwriting was elegant, slanted with the kind of care that belonged to another era. His chest tightened when he saw the return address, a conservatory in Boston where he had once been a young man with boundless dreams. He opened it slowly, as if the paper itself might crumble in his hands. Inside was a letter on thick stationery, the ink a deep blue. "Dear Mr. Whitmore, it has come to our attention that your composition, long considered unfinished, still circulates among a small circle of scholars and admirers. A student recently presented a paper on the last melody, tracing its origins and its mysterious disappearance. The conservatory would be honored if you would consider returning to share the completed piece, or at the very least, to speak of its journey. With respect and admiration, Professor Eleanor Graves." Edward's breath caught. He had not heard his own name spoken in those halls for decades. The idea that his music, thought abandoned, still lingered in academic whispers both startled and unsettled him. Clara leaned in, eyes wide. "Edward, they want you to go back." He folded the letter carefully, setting it on the piano. "It's not that simple." "Why not?" she asked, her voice tinged with impatience. He stared at the keys, their ivory worn from years of touch. Memories flooded him. His wife sitting in the audience during his early performances, her smile brighter than any spotlight. The night she was gone, and how every note since had felt like ash. "I left that world behind," he said quietly. "It was too heavy to carry." Clara frowned, tapping her foot the way she always did when she was thinking hard. "But maybe the music didn't leave you. Maybe it waited for you." Her words struck like a gentle bell, resonant and true. Still, doubt gnawed at him. Could he really step into that world again? Could he bear the weight of being seen, not just by neighbors in his living room, but by peers, critics, strangers who knew nothing of his loss? That afternoon, Edward sat alone at the piano, letter resting beside him. He touched the keys absent-mindedly, letting fragments of the last melody drift into the air. But instead of finishing the piece, his fingers wandered elsewhere, playing tunes from his youth, spirited etudes, tender ballads, the first composition he ever dared to show an audience. As he played, memories unfolded. The conservatory halls lined with portraits of masters, the smell of varnished wood and ink-stained scores, the thrill of applause after his first recital, and beneath it all, the constant presence of his wife, her laughter, her encouragement, the way she whispered, "Play as if the world depends on it." Tears blurred the keys. For so long he had avoided these memories, afraid they would crush him. but instead, they warmed him, like sunlight on frost. Clara returned in the evening and found him still at the piano, the letter open once more. She didn't speak at first, only sat beside him, her presence steady. Finally, Edward turned to her. "Do you think, if I went, you would come with me?" Clara's face lit up. "Of course I'll be your partner. 2 hearts, remember?" He smiled faintly. 2 hearts, 1 melody. That night, Edward sat at his desk and began writing a reply. His hand trembled, not with fear, but with anticipation. He wrote slowly, carefully, as if each word were part of the composition itself. "Dear Professor Graves, your letter finds me at a time I believed my music had ended, but it seems life has other plans. The melody you speak of is no longer unfinished. It has grown, changed, found new breath, and perhaps it is time it found its way home." He signed his name, Edward Whitmore, and for the first time in years, it did not feel like a name from the past. It felt like a name still alive, still becoming. The past never truly leaves us. It waits quietly until we are ready to listen again, and when we do, it becomes not a burden, but a bridge. The train hummed steadily along the tracks, carrying Edward and Clara toward Boston. Outside the window, the landscape rolled by, fields melting into forests, forests into cities. Like pages turning in a story Edward had once closed, but now dared to reopen. Clara pressed her nose to the glass, wide-eyed. "It feels like an adventure," she said. Edward smiled faintly, though his hands trembled in his lap. Adventure, yes, but also reckoning. He had not set foot inside the conservatory in over 40 years. The thought of returning filled him with both dread and longing. When they arrived, the building stood before them, grand and dignified, its stone columns bathed in afternoon light. Edward paused at the gate, his heart thundering. How many times had he walked through those doors as a young man, brimming with ambition? And now he stood, an old man, carrying not ambition, but memory. Clara slipped her hand into his. 2 hearts, she reminded him. He inhaled deeply. Then together they entered. Inside, the conservatory smelled just as he remembered. Polished wood, old books, faint traces of rosin from violin bows. Students hurried down the corridors with sheet music tucked under their arms, their laughter bouncing against the high ceilings. For a moment, Edward felt as though he had stepped back in time, except his reflection in the glass case, lined face, silver hair, reminded him how many years had passed. Professor Eleanor Graves met them at the entrance to the recital hall. She was a tall woman with sharp eyes softened by kindness. "Mr. Whitmore," she said warmly, taking his hand, "it is an honor to finally meet you. Your music has lingered in these walls longer than you know." Edward bowed his head slightly, humbled. "And this is Clara," he introduced, "my partner in melody." Clara grinned and curtsied playfully, earning a chuckle from the professor. "We've scheduled your performance for this evening," Professor Graves explained. "It will be informal, intimate, faculty, a few students, some old admirers of your work. Nothing overwhelming." Edward's pulse quickened. This was it, the moment he had both feared and yearned for. That evening, the recital hall filled slowly. The room was modest compared to the grand theaters Edward once knew, but its wooden acoustics carried warmth. The audience whispered with anticipation, their eyes drawn to the piano at center stage. Backstage, Edward paced. His hands felt stiff, colder than usual. The weight of expectation pressed on him like a familiar but unwelcome cloak. Clara watched him carefully. "You're scared," she said, not accusingly, but as fact. He gave a weary smile. "Terrified." She took his hand, squeezing it. "Then let's be terrified together." Those words steadied him more than any speech of encouragement could. When they stepped onto the stage, the room fell silent. Edward sat at the piano, Clara perched on a small stool beside him. For a moment, he hesitated, his fingers hovering over the keys. Then he glanced at Clara. She nodded, and he began. The opening notes of the last melody flowed into the hall, fragile yet certain. At first, Edward's hands trembled, But as Clara hummed beside him, the music found its strength. Together they wove the story they had built, sorrow mingling with laughter, grief entwined with hope. The audience leaned in, breathless. Halfway through, Edward faltered, the old fear rising in him. His hands froze above the keys. A hush spread across the hall. Clara leaned close, whispering, "It's morning now, remember?" Her words lifted him. He struck the playful trill they had discovered, the notes sparkling like sunlight breaking through clouds. The audience gasped softly, drawn deeper into the transformation of the piece. As they reached the end, Edward felt something extraordinary. The melody no longer belonged to his grief, nor even solely to him. It belonged to Clara, to the audience, to anyone who had ever carried loss yet still reached for dawn. The final chord rang out, not heavy but luminous, hanging in the air like a benediction. For a moment, silence. Then the hall erupted into applause, standing ovation, cheers, tears glistening in strangers' eyes. Edward bowed his head, overwhelmed. Clara, grinning ear to ear, tugged his sleeve and whispered, "See? They heard our story." After the performance, people gathered around him. Students eager to ask questions, professors thanking him for his courage, neighbors from long ago who remembered his name. But Edward's gaze kept drifting to Clara, who chatted happily with anyone who would listen. For decades he had believed his music had ended, yet here it was, alive again, carried on two hearts instead of one. Courage is not the absence of fear, but the decision to play despite trembling hands. And when we share our story, we discover that its echoes belong to many, not just to us. The morning after the recital, Edward awoke in the conservatory's guest room. Sunlight streamed through tall windows, painting the floor in gold. For the first time in decades, he had slept without nightmares of failure. The applause still echoed in his chest, not as a ghost, but as a blessing. Clara was already awake, sitting cross-legged on the rug with a notebook in her lap. She looked up and grinned. "I'm writing the sequel," she said proudly. Edward chuckled. "The sequel? Of course. Every story needs another chapter." She tapped the page. "This one's called The First Dawn." The title struck him deeply. For years he had thought his unfinished composition was an end. But perhaps Clara was right. Every ending was simply a doorway to another beginning. Later that day, Professor Graves invited them into her office. "Mr. Whitmore," she said, "your performance last night reminded us that music is not simply art. It's testimony. We'd like to preserve the last melody in the conservatory's archives, alongside the works of other greats. Will you allow us?" Edward's throat tightened. He had never thought his music worthy of permanence, but Clara squeezed his hand and whispered, "Say yes. It's the right place." He nodded slowly. "Yes, but remember, it isn't mine alone. It was completed by two hearts." Professor Graves smiled. "Then we shall credit both Edward Whitmore and Clara Bennett, a rare, beautiful partnership." Clara's eyes widened. "My name in the archives?" She giggled, half in disbelief, half in pride. Edward looked at her, his heart swelling. So this is legacy, he thought, not merely leaving something behind, but passing it on to another who will carry it forward. That evening, they took a slow walk through the city streets. Boston buzzed with life, vendors shouting, carriages rattling, musicians playing violins on corners. Clara skipped ahead, her laughter weaving through the noise like a melody of its own. Edward followed at his own pace, every step a meditation. He thought of his wife, how she had urged him never to stop playing, how her memory had once been an anchor of grief but was now a sail of guidance. He thought of the silence that had nearly consumed him, and of Clara's voice that had broken it open. When they reached the harbor, Clara leaned on the railing, staring at the water shimmering with sunset. "Edward," she asked softly, "are you happy now?" He paused, letting the question settle in him. Happiness, he realized, was not the absence of sorrow. It was the weaving of sorrow with joy, loss with love, silence with song. "Yes," he said, his voice steady. For the first time in a very long time I am. Clara beamed and slipped her small hand into his. Months later, back in his quiet town, Edward's house no longer felt like a mausoleum. Music filled its rooms daily. Children from the neighborhood often gathered to listen, drawn by Clara's invitations. The piano became not a monument to the past, but a bridge to the future. On a spring morning, Edward sat at the bench, Clara beside him. "Shall we play it again?" he asked. Clara shook her head mischievously. "Not today. Today we write something new." And so they did. Notes spilled across the keys, clumsy, playful, radiant. A new melody not bound by sorrow but lifted by joy. Edward realized then, the last melody was never truly the last. It was the threshold to all that would follow. As years passed, Clara grew and Edward aged further. His hands became slower, his steps more fragile. But the bond between them deepened, woven by music and trust. And when Edward finally felt his time nearing, he had no fear. He left behind not just a completed composition, but a living testament. A girl who knew that music was bread to be shared, who understood that legacies are written not only in notes, but in hearts. On the final page of his journal, Edward wrote a single line before closing it forever. The last melody is always the first dawn. Life is a symphony of endings and beginnings. What we believe to be our last note may, in truth, be the first sound of someone else's song. And in that passing, we discover the truest music of all: connection, legacy, and love.